When Dorian was 20 years old, I was 30. I accompanied him from having nothing to becoming a new upstart in the circle. And then I watched helplessly as he fell in love with someone else. When I was 37 years old, Dorian was 27. He was drunk but his eyes were clear as he looked at me. And he took the opportunity to say what he had buried in his heart for a long time. Orange. You don't deserve me anymore. If there were a magic moonlight box, I would definitely stop the 20-year-old Dorian from running towards you. A car accident brought us back to the beginning. This time, he was crying and begging me not to let him go. When I went to pick up Dorian, I learned that the company was holding a celebration banquet tonight. Becoming famous at a young age and squeezing into the circle of business celebrities to become a new upstart. Dorian has always been very lucky and can get everything he wants. However, as a partner of the company, I didn't receive an invitation to this grand event. It is widely rumored in the outside world that there is a woman by Dorian's side who has accompanied him in his struggles for many years. This person accompanied him from being unknown to where he is now and has witnessed his setbacks and glories. Some people guessed that it was me, but he denied them one by one. To the outside world, Dorian said that he didn't want to share his private emotions with others. When facing me, he said it was because he was afraid that others would talk about my age and didn't want me to be caught in the whirlpool of public opinion. Even he himself didn't realize that at the beginning when this thought came up, the one who was most afraid was actually him. When I arrived, the banquet had just ended. When are you going to break up? You've always minded that she's older than you. Orange will be 37 after the spring festival. What's the difference between sleeping with someone for 7 years and being in a second marriage? Be careful that if you delay any longer, you really won't be able to get rid of her. I stood at the door, feeling icy all over, and my fingertips had to clench tightly because of the trembling. The stinging pain in my palm helped me barely stay awake. Before coming to the banquet, that girl found me. She was in her early 20s. With a young face full of collagen and not even a single fine line. She didn't act arrogantly as I had imagined, being favored by Dorian. Instead, she spoke softly. And even her choice of words and sentences seemed to have been carefully considered, making her look gentle and cultivated. She said she was pregnant. Dorian said that you gave him your best years. And he can't bear the consequences of breaking up with you. So I have to be the bad guy. He also said that he will claim to the outside world that I'm the woman who accompanied him in his struggles for 7 years. Sister. You understand. Right? Dorian and I are true love. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. With just a few words from her. They were true love. Then what were the 7 years between me and Dorian? After getting in the car, Dorian kept his eyes closed throughout the journey and remained silent, not even bothering to look at me. The old scar at the end of his eyebrow was faintly visible under the light. That scar was left when he desperately saved me. Once he said that it was a medal of his love for me. But later when the love was gone, that scar also became an inescapable shackle on him. I retracted my gaze and said calmly, "Let's talk." I don't know when he opened his eyes. His eyes, as dark and still as water, were immersed in the thick night. The dim streetlight shone through the car, reflecting on the face that was no longer young, with a look of calmness and solemnity between the eyebrows. I know that he doesn't have the courage to be the bad guy and bear the infamy. So it was the girl carrying his child who made everything clear, and now even when it comes to breaking up, he is trying to make me bring it up. But I won't say it. It can't always be others who are the bad guys while he can enjoy the final results without getting his hands dirty. The years have long washed away his youthfulness, leaving behind the determination to step on everyone to climb to the top in order to achieve his goals. I'm not willing to let him have his way. Dorian, let's get married. Following that was a low sneer. It came dully from his throat, carrying the disdain and mockery of a superior. He was laughing at my whimsical idea. With what should we get married? Is your dowry your father who sells his daughter and your brother who depends on you? Orange. You know very well that you don't deserve me anymore. Once you said that I was the monkey king on the colorful auspicious clouds who appeared in your life. But if there were a magic moonlight box now, I would definitely stop the 20-year-old Dorian from running towards you. I don't know how long he had buried such words in his heart. The moment he said them, I could even hear him heave a long sigh. As if he had exhaled all the unbearable things he had endured over the years. As if I didn't hear him, I asked him in a low voice. Do you remember what you said when we first got together 7 years ago? He thought I was trying to hold him back, and there was a bit of contempt in his words. It was just youthful ignorance. How old was I at that time? Naturally, I believed that I could love someone until the end of time. I shook my head and answered irrelevant lie. I want to ask about another sentence you said 7 years ago. When we first fell in love, we didn't always foresee good things. We also made the worst plans, and even made the most vicious vows. At that time, you said that if one of us were to be unfaithful in the future, the betrayer. Before I could finish my words, a runaway gas tank truck suddenly rushed out at the crossroads. The moment the gas tank truck violently crashed into the driver's seat, I seemed to see Dorian, who was sitting in the passenger seat, panic-stricken and pouncing towards me. When I realized that I had been reborn, I had just escaped from the intense pain. The pain all over my body, as if I had been run over, was impossible to ignore, but it couldn't compare to the shock I felt the moment I saw Dorian. At 20 years old, his facial features were young and tender, and even the scar at the end of his eyebrow had disappeared. Dorian, who was lying on the ground, was covered in injuries, his eyes tightly closed, and his breathing weak. I no longer had to endure the indifference and boredom in his eyes when he faced me. He didn't seem to be completely unconscious yet, and he was still muttering something. I looked around and found that it was the familiar alley in my memory. Back then, it was here that I saved Dorian, who had almost lost his life after being robbed. After waking up, he approached me in the name of repaying his gratitude. The young man's feelings were passionate and sincere, and my locked heart gradually opened up to him. And later I fell deeply in love with him beyond redemption. I believed that the feelings we once had were pure and real. But they couldn't stop it from finally breaking into pieces beyond repair. I hesitated for a moment. But in the end, I still dialed the emergency call. Yes, heading so en session. The person is still alive. Sorry. I have something more important to do. This matter was far more important than saving Dorian. However, when I hung up the phone and was about to leave, the hem of my pants was gently tugged by the person behind me. When I turned around, I met those cold and sharp eyes. My heart seemed to be hit hard by a heavy object, and I froze in place. At that moment, I seemed to see the 27-year-old Dorian. After a moment of hesitation, I looked up around me. There was no surveillance. When I shook off Dorian's hand heavily, the confusion and incomprehension that flashed in his eyes almost swallowed him up. Until I walked out of that dark alley. The sun was shining brightly, and the street lined with plane trees was dappled with shadows. Feeling the oncoming sunlight, I could still feel the burning gaze behind me. But I didn't look back. This time, I wished Dorian a smooth and unobstructed path ahead. I won't be there anymore. I returned to the company 7 years ago. In my previous life, because I saved Dorian, I didn't answer the general manager's call, which led to me missing the opportunity to develop in the branch company later. Staying in the original position and continuing to be the project team leader had no prospects. Later on, I sacrificed my career to accompany Dorian in his struggles, but what I got was an unaccompanied lead status. This time, I must seize the opportunity. Rushing to the company against time. The general manager was holding the phone with an anxious expression. She let out a sigh of relief when she saw me. Orange. You're just in time. There's a problem with the project in Pingchang. Since you were the one who followed the project from the beginning, it's most suitable for you to solve it. After saying that, she didn't forget to pat my shoulder meaningfully. The head office attaches great importance to this project. As long as you do a good job, you'll definitely get benefits. Although the boss is good at making empty promises, I know that this time she really hit the mark. I decisively took on this heavy responsibility. When I got home in the evening, I wasn't surprised to see my father at the door of my house. In fact, I had already mentally prepared myself. On this day in my previous life, I avoided my father's harassment because I saved Dorian. Afterwards, he even warned me that I might be able to avoid it for a while, but not forever. I opened the door, and my father walked into the bedroom as if there was no one else there. After checking and not seeing any signs of a man living there, he began to list my crimes. You said you'll be 30 after the spring festival. Instead of finding a man to marry quickly, what's the use of just focusing on work all day long? After saying that, he spat a mouthful of thick phlegm onto the spotless wooden floor that I had mopped. The village chief introduced his relative to you. He's in his early 40s and his wife just died. Since you don't want to get married or have children, he's just the right person for you. The bride price has already been negotiated. 88,000 yuan is just enough for your younger brother to marry a wife. Your salary over the years can be used as the dowry, so that others won't say that the Zhang family has treated you unfairly. I couldn't help but laugh until tears came to my eyes. After working hard and living frugally for so many years, I never expected that it was all for me to marry myself off. Just as my father was about to get angry, I calmed him down first. Actually, after struggling outside for all these years, I've also realized that although it seems like I'm living in a big city, all my salary goes to paying the rent, water, and electricity bills for others. Getting married is also a good thing. At least I'll have someone to rely on. After so many years of interactions with my father, he naturally didn't believe my nonsense. It wasn't until I handed over my salary card to him. Help me save it first. After I finish the work handover, I'll go home and get married after the spring festival. He was about to say something, but I stopped him with a word. After I complete this project in my hand, I can get a bonus of tens of thousands of yuan. And the work handover after resigning will take a month. If I leave early, I won't get my salary for that month. He cursed and warned me that he would give me a month's time before he left. I stared at the sticky filth on the ground. It was as if a poisonous snake was coiling around my neck, making it difficult for me to breathe. In my previous life, I endured my father for another 7 years after this. Dorian, who once felt a strong connection with me because of the misfortune of our original families, later grew tired of me. Perhaps this was part of the reason. But these things had always existed. And even the 7-year age difference between us didn't suddenly appear. However, people's hearts changed suddenly. The business trip went smoothly. The headquarters plans to set up a branch in Pingcheng next year and needs business backbones to explore the market. I seized the opportunity that I missed when I saved Dorian. Just as I dragged my suitcase to the door of my house, I saw someone who shouldn't have been there on the steps at the corner of the stairs. The cold winter wind blew into the corridor through the gaps in the windows. It was bone-chillingly cold. He was dressed thinly and huddled up on the steps, shivering. The moment the elevator door across from him opened, a glimmer of hope seemed to ignite in his bright eyes. The next moment, as he didn't see the person he wanted to see, his eyes suddenly dimmed, and he hung his head dejectedly. It wasn't until the sound of footsteps startled him. The moment he looked up, I seemed to see the Dorian I had deeply loved 7 years ago. He was always full of vitality, and his vivid life force once infected and healed me. Hearing the noise, he stood up from the ground with a swoosh, and his clear eyes changed from being puzzled to shining brightly. Sister, I finally waited for you. This address made me frown involuntarily. Do we know each other? I stared at his face intently, trying to find the slightest flaw. Dorian seemed a bit nervous and stood there awkwardly. I got the address from the policeman brother and then asked the neighbors after I found this place. I know it's a bit presumptuous, but I still want to thank you in person. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be alive now. Because of his special situation, the police officers did come to me to ask about the specific circumstances. After saying that, he quickly pushed all the gifts piled beside him in front of me. Sister, if you need any help in the future, I will definitely do my part. Even though the scene was different from that in my previous life. Like the Dorian 7 years ago, he was a bit rash in his actions, but had no ill intentions. I can't explain what that glance he gave me in the alley meant, just as I can't explain the fact that I was reborn. Seeing that he became more and more nervous under my silent scrutiny, the tips of his thin ears began to turn faintly red. I took the gifts with a cold expression. It's just a small favor. After saying that, I directly pushed the door and entered the house, with no intention of inviting him in. The snubbed Dorian seemed to be stunned for a moment. And then he quickly handed me a piece of paper. I won't disturb you so late. This is my phone number. Sister. You can contact me anytime if you have something. Not long after he left, I heard him running back like a gust of wind. The voice-activated lights in the corridor turned on one by one. The moment Dorian stopped, the light above his head clearly outlined his eyebrows and eyes. His broken hair was gently lifted by the night wind. And there was a certain throbbing in his eyes. Bright and pure. His voice was clear, filled with an indescribable excitement. Sister. I haven't introduced myself yet. My name is Dorian. The moonlight outside the window was lonely. The voice-activated lights in the corridor went out and then turned on again. In my previous life, Dorian, who woke up in the hospital, also introduced himself like this. Even when I noticed his burning feelings, I refused to tell him my phone number. At that time, he also stuffed me with a piece of paper with his phone number written on it. In the boundless night, that piece of paper that I once treasured now lay alone on the ground. It would never again be the splash of color that adorned my life. In a week, I will leave here to develop in the branch company. As he wishes. There will be no more intersections between us in this life. However, I didn't expect to see Dorian again the next day. When I came back from my morning run, I saw him standing at the door with breakfast in his hand. He was practicing in front of the snow-white wall on how to give me the breakfast without appearing presumptuous. For a moment, I felt it was ironic. I wonder what the 27-year-old Dorian would think if he saw himself at this moment, just starting to have his first crush. Now, Dorian knows nothing. And he just looks awkward and nervous after being caught by me. Standing in front of me, he was over 1.8 meters tall, and his face was as red as a child who had been caught stealing candy. Sister. I really want to thank you. Sincerely. At this moment, I couldn't see the harshness and indifference of the 27-year-old Dorian in him at all. But I still couldn't suppress the deep-seated disgust in my heart. Love is something that should be mutual. I don't blame Dorian for not loving me. I just hate that he turned our 7-year relationship into a joke. Dorian. Then do me one last favor. The whole process of moving was smooth. Except that Dorian was a bit absent-minded. Sister. Won't you come back after you move to Pingchang? Can I go to visit you during my vacation? My original family wasn't a good one. And Dorian's relationship with his father wasn't any better either. As a child who wasn't accepted by his father's first wife, he had been raised outside since his mother passed away. I guessed that perhaps because he lacked love and had a bit of an Oedipus complex. He fell in love with me at first sight, despite the significant age difference between us. Looking at Dorian, who seemed calm on the surface but was so nervous that he was almost crushing the cardboard box in his hands, I came straight to the point. Do you like me? His eyes suddenly shook, and his cheeks instantly turned red. Even his eyes were covered with a hazy mist due to his excitement. Sister. I know this is a bit sudden. But I interrupted him inferiorly, we're not suitable. And I don't like boys younger than me. Strictly speaking, I just don't like him. When I spoke, I didn't even need to look at him to feel Dorian's instant dejected mood and the sense of loss and confusion that surrounded him. After a long time, he said dejectedly, I'm sorry. Sister. You saved me. But instead, I've caused you trouble. It wasn't him who should be sorry to me, but the 27-year-old Dorian. At the same time, the door was suddenly slammed open from the outside. My father rushed in furiously, his eyes blazing with anger as he swept the room, as if verifying something. Seeing the packed boxes piled in the living room, he rushed towards me without thinking. You useless girl. I almost believed your nonsense. If it weren't for your brother reminding me to come and take a look, how could I have found out that you actually dared to move without telling me? In a fit of rage, he gathered all his strength and kicked me to the ground. The moment my head hit the floor with a bang, the whole world started spinning. Section ed article truck the last time I moved without telling my father. After he found out, he beat me up on the main road of the community where people were coming and going. He threatened to kill me if I dared to play any tricks again. The year I graduated from high school, I resolutely stepped onto the train to Shanghai. just to escape the nightmare that had haunted me for more than a decade. But the reality is cruel. And it seems that I can never get rid of my father. Since I was a child, I couldn't understand why, as his children, he could be so extremely partial to my younger brother. Later, I figured it out. Don't waste time on other people's mistakes. Otherwise, the prison you draw for yourself will always trap you. Dorian didn't know who the other person was. After witnessing me being beaten, he suddenly flew into a rage. Like an angry and out-of-control beast, he rushed straight towards my father. And the two immediately started fighting. I supported my aching head and just got close to the two of them. There was a dull and heavy thud. The scalding blood splashed directly onto my face and into my eyes. The bright red color spread in my pupils. And I could only watch helplessly as Dorian fell limply to the floor. At the same time, my father's face turned pale with fright. In a panic, he threw away the claw hammer that he had somehow found in the toolbox and fled in a hurry. The scene of Dorian saving me in my previous life overlapped with what was happening in front of me. When I hugged him, I realized that my whole body was trembling uncontrollably as if my blood had been frozen. The hospital room was cold and quiet. The sunlight outside the window was dazzling. And it fell mottled through the branches between Dorian's youthful eyebrows. He was unconscious, his face pale, and his brows furrowed tightly as if he were caught in a nightmare. His fragile and broken appearance made him look particularly pitiful and helpless. Even though he was injured so badly, Dorian's family still didn't care about him. No one showed up from beginning to end. I could only take care of him in the hospital while handling my work. Once, the 20-year-old Dorian brought about an emotional change in me, making me feel like I was truly alive. I was no longer so cold-blooded and stubbornly trying to be strong. And I was no longer indifferent to pain. I would show weakness and act corpuscular because I had someone to rely on. And my heart would throb because of his kindness to me. The 20-year-old him taught me how to love someone. At this moment, looking at him who was injured while saving me again, the emotions that had been sealed in my heart for a long time were on the verge of leaking out. I know that I can never be indifferent to the 20-year-old Dorian. Dorian woke up at some point. But the moment our eyes met, my heart suddenly ached. The emotions that had just risen in my heart collapsed and disappeared without a trace in an instant. He just looked at me quietly, and I recognized him at a glance. He wasn't Dorian. To be precise, he wasn't the 20-year-old Dorian. It was as if there were two souls in the same body. This time, the 27-year-old Dorian had taken control of the body. He sneered. "It seems you're disappointed that it's me who woke up. That idiot actually got himself into this mess again because of you." For a moment, a sense of endless loss and bitterness engulfed me. Yes. What was I expecting? Hasn't 7 years taught you not to make the same mistake twice? I can't explain what's going on in front of me. While I was lost in thought, Dorian sneered at me ironically. He did it on purpose, trying to provoke me. Once I started arguing with him, he could justifiably continue to mock me. But I just looked at him quietly, not even having the desire to say one more word to him. The 27-year-old Dorian can no longer control my emotions. He also seemed to sense my indifference. The moment I turned around, he instinctively reached out and grabbed me. A trace of panic flashed across his face. And then he gritted his teeth and ordered, "Orange. You're not allowed to leave me again." Then I remembered that in this life, Dorian was still a penniless college student. Even the medical expenses were advanced by me. If it were the high-spirited Dorian 7 years ago, he might not have been willing to reveal his most vulnerable needs because of his pride. But the 27-year-old Dorian would stop at nothing to achieve his goals and naturally put all his own interests first. At this moment, he was even more at ease ordering others around. I suddenly remembered the words he said. That I wasn't worthy of him. I retorted, "Isn't this exactly what you want? The 37-year-old Orange isn't worthy of the 27-year-old Dorian. So naturally, the 20-year-old Dorian isn't worthy of the 30-year-old Orange either." I shook off his hand. "Dorian," and let out a low sigh. "This is all you taught me." He suddenly froze in place. It seemed that he was hurt by my indifference, and became a bit flustered and tongue-tied. "Orange. If you dare to leave, I'll see your father." In the end, The one who will be in trouble is only you. After being with Dorian, I used money to satisfy my father's greed. I always thought that by maintaining the superficial balance, I could whitewash the peace. Dorian knew clearly that I didn't want to have a falling out with my father. Otherwise I wouldn't have endured him for so many years. Looking at Dorian, who thought he had grasped my weakness, I couldn't help laughing. However, his face gradually turned unpleasant. Dorian, I want to thank you for giving me a chance to start over. Remember, the person who hurt you is Changliang Zhang, and I've already called the police for you. From now on, there will be no more connection between us. Dorian seemed to be severely hit and stood there in a daze, unable to say a word. At night, I had a dream. In the dream, the 20-year-old Dorian was trapped in a small transparent house. He desperately shouted, trying to break through the room. But there was something invisible that trapped him. And no matter what he did, it was in vain. Finally, he collapsed on the ground, completely exhausted, with a face full of despair. I was awakened by the strange noise coming from the living room. I got up in a panic. I opened the bedroom door a crack and saw Dorian with a bandage on his head in the living room. The moonlight elongated his shadow, casting a desolate and cold reflection on the floor. Then I remembered that the 27-year-old Dorian knew exactly where I often kept the spare key. My blood seemed to congeal, and a rush of anger welled up in my head. Dorian, are you crazy? When he realized he was discovered, he simply ignored me, and his originally cautious movements became unrestrained. He stretched out his long legs, relaxed his body and mind, and lay on the sofa in the living room. He let out a sigh as if getting rid of all his fatigue. I'll take a nap. I'll leave after a nap. I didn't even bother to say words of refusal. I directly reached out and dragged him up from the sofa. Dorian, if you have any sense of shame, you should know to stay away from me. Dorian was much taller than me, and his deliberate resistance made it impossible for me to move him at all. Ignoring my disgust, he just looked at me with dark eyes after getting up, like a bottomless cold pool. Orange. Don't move away. Okay? If you move to Ping Chang, what should I do? After saying that, his gaze fell on the packed suitcase in the living room. Realizing what he was talking about, I panicked and knocked away his hand, reaching towards my cheek. Stung by the confusion and disgust in my eyes, he let out a faint, bitter laugh. Do you know? When you left me in the alley that day, I was actually already awake, but I didn't have the strength. Later, I don't know why, but I was trapped in a transparent room when I was unconscious, and watched the 20-year-old me fall in love with you along the original path. I desperately tried to escape from that room, thinking that if I had the right to choose, I could stay away from you. But since I woke up, my mind has been full of the cruel back view of you abandoning me in the alley. At that moment, I suddenly realized that I couldn't accept the fact that you left me at all. After saying that, Dorian suddenly grabbed my shoulders, and there was a trace of resentment in his eyes. Orange, you make me feel like the one who was abandoned. You're moving towards the light, but you left me alone in a dark swamp. If all that I'm suffering now is the punishment from heaven for me, I won't accept it. Even if we were together for 7 years, it can't be the reason to trap me for a lifetime. Choosing whom to love is my freedom. I'm not wrong. Even if I made the wrong choice in the end. I was stunned for a long time by his words. Looking at Dorian again, it was as if I was meeting him for the first time. Dorian, your shamelessness really surprises me. He suddenly stood up from the sofa. His tall and slender figure exuded an oppressive aura, forcing me to step back step by step. Before the car accident, you asked me if I was willing to marry you. I'm answering you now. I am willing. And I swear that I will never betray you again. Otherwise. I sneered and interrupted him. I mentioned getting married at that time just to see how shameless Dorian could be. And he didn't disappoint me in the end. In the previous life, he made a similar vow. Unfortunately, hadn't fulfilledly. Vows can only comfort each other when there is mutual affection. You want to say that the betrayer will lose the one they love forever. Right? Dorian. You should also realize that the love in losing the one you love forever is not just about me. I seem to suddenly understand a reason for Dorian's loss of control. The reason why he had been ignored by his father for years was that among the illegitimate children, Dorian was the most useless one. He didn't know how to compete for favor. And even his success in starting a business, which made his father look at him differently, was due to my help. I taught him little by little, transforming him from a short-sighted poor student into the most outstanding one among his peers. Later, I helped him start his business and shared my resources with him. I knew exactly how much he wanted to succeed and how much he wanted his father to think highly of him. So, I sacrificed my own opportunity to start a business and even gave up my career in the end to become a partner in his company. All I wanted was to lead the company and stand with him at the height that everyone looked up to, so that he would no longer be the child trapped by the shadows of his childhood. Once a person has experienced the glory of standing at the peak, they won't be willing to fall back into the quagmire. Given a chance to start over, Dorian wasn't sure that he could rely on himself to rise from nothing to success again. This was the real reason why he didn't dare to leave me. But at the moment, I didn't want to expose the ugly paranoia hidden in his heart. Because there were many ways to get rid of him. But I wanted to choose the most convenient one, in order to make him let down his guard and give me time to prepare. That night, I coaxed him back to the hospital. Dorian was really too weak. He gasped heavily even when talking to me for a few more words. I was so afraid that before I left, he would die in my rental house first and I would be held responsible for his life. He thought I had compromised. But I just couldn't bring myself to reconcile with him. At the same time, he seemed to realize that I had a higher tolerance for the 20-year-old him. So, he was no longer so aggressive and showed me his softest side. At night, in the quiet ward, the clear smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils. He hugged me tightly from behind. And his voice was peaceful and content. In the previous life, at the moment when I saw that car crashing towards us, there was only one thought in my mind. I wanted to protect you. You couldn't have an accident. And you definitely couldn't leave me. I don't know how to make you believe that I really know I was wrong. After I graduate, let's get married. In the previous life, he said the same thing. Unfortunately, after graduation, he threw himself into his career wholeheartedly in order to succeed. Several times when I reminded him, he would say, "Just wait a little longer." This waiting lasted for 7 years. The police came to the hospital and asked some simple questions. Dorian said he was willing to settle it privately. My father kept calling these 2 days, saying that he had injured Dorian's head because of me. I had to pay for it. After hanging up the phone, Dorian fed the peeled apple to my mouth. I just wanted to teach Chang Liangzhong a lesson. He kicked you so hard. I've already let him off by not beating him up. You're not allowed to give him money. Seeing that I didn't respond, Dorian frowned slightly, looking distressed but not daring to show it too much. Until I got up to pour water. He was so scared that he reached out and hugged me into his arms. If you don't want me to target him, I can make peace. And I won't say anything bad about your family anymore. I know I'm selfish and hypocritical. And you also think that I'm trying to win you back with a purpose. But I've experienced the uneasiness of losing you. And no one cares about you more than I do. I will definitely prove that I love you more than the 20-year-old me did. His hot breath printed on my neck. My thoughts were a bit dazed. I don't know if he really loves me. But he must love himself the most. Until his actions became more and more excessive. I held down his hand. Okay. I'll give you a chance to prove it. The way to get rid of someone is not just to keep refusing. You can also make them give up when they encounter difficulties. The most effective way is to hit his pride that he takes pride in. When Dorian's father appeared in the ward, Dorian was hugging me and acting coquettously. Look. You told me to get up and move around more. And I'm being so obedient. Then can you smile at me more? You look the most beautiful when you smile. Dorian's father pushed the door open quietly. Dorian seemed to sense something and his gaze fell directly on me. I had dealt with Dorian's father several times in the previous life. He came from a prestigious family. Proud and conceited. His experience was somewhat similar to Dorian's. He was the child who wasn't favored or valued by his father. So after seizing power, he allowed himself to make mistakes, and didn't allow himself to be criticized by others. Proud of his noble bloodline, He had always disagreed with Dorian marrying me in the previous life. But now Dorian was no longer the kind of person who could be easily manipulated. You've never cared about me. So I don't need your permission to marry whoever I want. As the person in charge of the Dorian family, he naturally wouldn't allow a dispensable illegitimate child to disobey him. Dorian's father's expression didn't change at all. But the next second he slapped Dorian hard in the face. If I hadn't been paying for you to live, you would have died on the street long ago. What the hell do you think you are? Daring to shout at me. The blood oozing from the corner of his mouth made the pale-faced Dorian look weak and embarrassed. He was silent for a moment. And the veins on his clenched fists bulged. After enduring it for a long time, he finally erupted. You might as well have killed me at the beginning. So that I wouldn't have to endure being looked down upon and despised by others. I've been alone for more than 10 years. I'm fed up with the days of having no one to love me. Orange is the only one who is willing to give everything to be good to me. I like her and want to be with her. What right do you have to interfere? Dorian's father couldn't help but sneer. As if mocking his ignorance and stupidity. I've already investigated her background. It's indeed pitiful that she grew up in a blood-sucking family. But there will be continuous troubles in the future. I can't allow a time bomb to be buried beside me. I've already agreed to her request. With 1 million yuan, she will completely disappear from your life. Dorian, who was originally emotional, froze. His head hung low, looking as if he were dead. Lonely and quiet. After a long while, he raised his head and gave me a despairing smile. You did it on purpose. You hate me so much. I looked at him directly without any guilt. You see, your value is just like that. Dorian's father is extremely wealthy. Yet he is only willing to pay 1 million yuan to buy out his son's feelings. Based on what do you think that you, who have betrayed me, are worth more in my eyes? When I left the hospital room, Dorian's eyes were bloodshot. And he pounced on me like a madman. But at the last moment, he was firmly held down by Dorian's father's subordinates. His face, having fulfilled my obsession, which was so excited that it turned red, was forced to press against the floor. And he was pinned to the ground in an embarrassed and humiliating posture. He struggled desperately but to no avail. In the end, he collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, like a stray dog. Before the door closed, I looked into his eyes through the gap. There was pain and despair. As if he had been pulled into the abyss. But this time, I won't be soft-hearted anymore. Early the next morning, I immediately contacted a moving company without delay. It was only when I saw the moving company off that I finally let out a sigh of relief. The vehicle drove away in front of me. Immediately afterwards, I saw Dorian in a hospital gown across the road. He looked vulnerable and embarrassed. His feet, which he didn't have time to put on shoes, were scratched by the broken glass on the roadside. The wounds were turned outward and bleeding. It was obvious that he had escaped from the hospital. The wind blew through the corners of his clothes and his hair. And he was so weak that he seemed as if he would be blown away at any moment. In an instant, my whole heart was clenched tightly again. I didn't know that he could be so paranoid. It wasn't until the person across the road approached me step by step that I finally recognized who he was. However, the next second, a black car out of control rushed towards me. Dorian visibly panicked and rushed over from the opposite side to hug me. There was a violent collision and excruciating pain. Before my consciousness faded away, I heard a familiar and sorrowful voice. It turns out that I was such a jerk at the age of 27. After saying that, warm tears fell on my neck. Sister, the 20-year-old Dorian really loves you. So never forgive him after 7 years. The 20-year-old Dorian regained control of his body at the last moment. Just to say a final goodbye to me. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital room 7 years later. The doctor said that I had been in a coma for a long time after being hit by a gas tanker. Fortunately, having fulfilled my obsession, the person in the passenger seat protected you at that time. So you managed to escape danger. The doctor explained. After the gas tanker hit the car I was driving, the car was pushed to the side of the road. The huge impact force made the guardrail pierce through the entire passenger seat directly. If Dorian hadn't protected me, he might have died on the spot. Of course, If he hadn't protected me, I would have endured an even greater impact. What happened when I met the 20-year-old Dorian seemed to be all in a dream. I can't explain that extremely real feeling. But going through it again has made me realize a lot of things. On the day I woke up from the car accident, the first person I saw was my father. He seemed very disappointed about my waking up. It's also a stroke of luck that you're okay this time. Otherwise, you should quickly make a will while you have the chance. The 7 years I spent with Dorian and becoming his business partner was perhaps the most unwise choice. But over the years, I have worked hard and dedicated myself to the company. As a business partner, the annual equity dividends were quite substantial. My father was hoping that I would have an accident again or even die directly, so that he could take over the property and real estate in my name justifiably. Compared with the Changliang John in the dream 7 years ago, he seemed to have aged a lot. For so many years, I have held on to my last hope, always thinking that it would be good to live in peace. At least, I could still say that I had a home. But is this really the home I need? A home should be a haven from the storm. But after living for more than 30 years, I have never felt the slightest bit of warmth that a family should bring. I can't change my father's twisted and deformed ideology of valuing sons over daughters. The only thing I can change is myself. I smiled and agreed. Okay. Turning around, I called in the company's lawyers and asked them to help me make a will. After my death, the real estate will be sold, and all the funds and property in my name will be used to establish a charity foundation to donate to the education of girls in mountainous areas. I even stopped the monthly money transfer to my family. My father realized that he had been outsmarted and ended up getting nothing. In a fit of rage, he blocked the downstairs of the company with my younger brother and sister-in-law, and he even learned the tricks of the self-media. He said that he had brought me up with great hardship for so many years, paid for my education, but in the end, I was going to sever ties with him. After the video was posted online, it fermented rapidly. It soon had a negative impact on the company. But it was my mother who raised me before I could remember things. Later, after my mother passed away, I became the one who did the most work and ate the least in that family. Even when I entered high school, I was admitted to it as the first-ranked student through my own efforts. Because I knew very well that studying was the only way for me to get out of the predicament I was in. If it were to the school subsidizing my food expenses every semester because they saw that I had good grades but was extremely poor, I simply wouldn't have been able to graduate from high school smoothly. As for that food expense subsidy, I even had to take out a part of it for my father. Not to mention the sanitary napkins and other expenses I needed during my adolescence. Self-abasement, poverty, and being taciturn almost ran through my entire high school career. It was a nightmare that I never wanted to recall for the rest of my life. So in the face of his accusations and the pressure of public opinion, I felt no guilt. I even regretted not severing ties with them earlier. Revealing the truth means tearing open the wounds that I had hidden again. But this time, I don't care about the outside world's opinions. I directly handed it over to the company's public relations department and lawyers to deal with. The public relations department revealed my experiences over the years. The teachers from my alma mater of high school spoke up for me. And even my former high school classmates successively exposed online the videos of my father causing trouble in the school several times, back then in order to force me to drop out of school and get married. Overnight, the direction of public opinion changed drastically, and the company's stock price also began to rise. Subsequently, the lawyer found my father. He showed the transfer records of the money I had given to my family over the years, as well as the legal certificates of me buying a house and getting my younger brother married. If they continued to make trouble, the lawyer would represent me to take back this part of the expenditure. If they didn't return it, we would meet in court directly. At that moment, they, heavily too, who were insatiable, realized how much money I had spent on them over the years. It was an astronomical figure for them, and they simply couldn't pay it back. Family affection cannot be bought out with money, but blood ties can be. 3 months after I woke up, Dorian also woke up. He specifically asked to see me. Coincidentally, I also had something to talk to him about. Just as I arrived outside the hospital room with the lawyer, I saw that woman. Her belly was already showing. Her limbs were slender. And her face was gaunt and tired. The superficial calmness and gentleness that I saw in her face when I first met her were no longer there. The indifference in her eyes turned into sharp harshness the moment she saw me. This is the real her. You haven't come to see him even once since you woke up. I took care of him for 3 months. Why does he want to see you as soon as he wakes up? I don't know the reason why Dorian insists on seeing me. But I don't intend to let the woman in front of me off. Perhaps at the critical moment of life and death, he suddenly realized that he was just playing with you. People's hearts change. He could betray our 7-year relationship. Based on what do you think you will be the most special one? These are truths that everyone understands. But some people always think that they will be the most special one. They haven't even figured out their own lives. Yet they delusion ally hope to reform a prodigal son. The woman looked scornful and smiled at me. Do you think he loves you? He has long been fed up with your assertiveness. You made him live like a loser. As if he could only achieve success through you. You only forced him to move forward, forced him to succeed. It seems that only when he succeeded was he worthy of you. He has long been fed up with you. And you still don't know it. But I'm different. I won't put any pressure on him. I won't force him to do things he doesn't like. And I won't force him to cater to the business partners he doesn't like. We are a match made in heaven. Ours is the purest love. As soon as she said this, I burst out laughing. The purest love. That's complete nonsense. The reason you don't force him is that you know that he has already reached a high position and gotten rid of the pressure of daily necessities. So he can think about platonic love. But if I take the company away from him, will you still be able to love him as before while staying with a disabled person? The woman's face changed drastically. And her features began to contort. Based on what? Who do you think you are? The company was built up by Dorian bit by bit. It will always be his. I couldn't help but smile. You fool. There is no Plato in reality. The Dorian family regarded Dorian after the car accident as a disgrace. The company's directors would never let a person who had lost his legs take control of the company. Over the years, they have witnessed my abilities and my dedication to the company. Even though I'm a woman, as long as I can guarantee their interests, it makes no difference who sits in that position. Before entering the door, I turned around and said to the woman who was being stopped by the lawyer and was yelling furiously, by the way, the house you're living in now was also bought for Dorian by me. It's in my name. Remember to ask Dorian to find you another place to live. Otherwise, I won't care if you're pregnant or not. The first time she dared to come to me relying on her pregnancy. She calculated that no one would dare to do anything to a pregnant woman. But she miscalculated. It's the most ignorant choice to confront money and power with one's own flesh and blood. There are many ways to make her disappear from my sight. Also, your father, who works in the Discipline Inspection Commission, is corrupt and has been investigated by the Procuratority. Your days of living comfortably are over. Behind me, there was the woman's extremely shrill scream of collapse. But I found it particularly pleasant to hear. When I entered the hospital room, I happened to meet Dorian's gaze. He had heard all the conversations outside the door. I thought he would be frustrated, angry, or depressed. But the way he looked at me was too calm and gentle. And I couldn't feel the slightest bit of hostility. If it weren't for the deep weariness in his eyes, I would even have suspected that I had mistaken him for someone else. Not wanting to talk to him much, I directly handed him the notice from the board of directors. Dorian didn't pay attention to the document I handed over and still stared at me blankly. I originally wanted to mock him coldly, but his reaction was really uninteresting. I turned around and was about to leave when the person behind me spoke. For the past 3 months, I've been trapped there. In an instant, I understood what he meant by that. It turned out that everything before wasn't a dream. Seeing me turn around suddenly, he seemed to have confirmed what he had thought in his heart and smiled softly. After you left, I regained control of my body. I wanted to prove that I could succeed on my own. I wanted to prove that I didn't try to keep you just because I wanted to use you. So I worked harder than before. And I was even more attentive than when I was with you. Without you pushing me, I didn't dare to slack off for even a moment. However, at the age of 27, I didn't stand in the position that I thought belonged to me. It was only when I had achieved everything in my middle age that I suddenly realized a problem. It's not that I'm so great, but that I met someone who made me a better person before. Yet I didn't cherish that person. After listening to him, I didn't feel touched in my heart. Only an overwhelming sense of sadness. He not only ruined his own life in this world but also the life that should have belonged to the 20-year-old Dorian in that world that didn't belong to him. Regret is the most useless emotion. Before I left, Dorian called out to me again. He apologized to me. I know I have no face to ask you to stay, but I still want to say sorry to you. My feelings for you have never changed. I knew this the moment the car accident happened. I remembered the 20-year-old Dorian in another time and space who unhesitatingly rushed towards me during the car accident. I owe him a thank you. Dorian. Parting on good terms is the best way to end this relationship. I will contact medical institutions abroad. You don't need to come back here anymore. No one here needs you anymore. The company doesn't need you. And I definitely don't need you either. Choosing to forgive is not because I'm magnanimous, but because I just don't want to have the slightest connection with him anymore. However, the sadness on his face seemed to be much more painful than not being forgiven. If I could choose again, I definitely wouldn't betray you. And I would definitely love you well. Soon, let out a low sigh. There came the sounds of regretful and despairing sobs from behind. If we could start over. No one can guarantee what the final answer would be. Fortunately, I don't care anymore. At the very last moment before leaving, I really wanted to ask him, what kind of life did Orange in that world lead later on? In the end,